mantras of our Divine Mother. Our Divine Mother says, in failure as well as in success, the Divine's grace is always there. With my love and my blessings, says our Divine Mother. Words of our Lord Sri Aurobindo from the collective works of our Lord Sri Aurobindo, Volume 24, Book Synthesis of Yoga, Volume 2, Chapter 1, The Principle of the Integral Yoga, page 609. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, the principle of integral yoga is the turning of one or of all powers of our human existence into a means of reaching the Divine Being. In an ordinary yoga, one main power of being or one group of its powers is made the means, vehicle, or the path. In synthetic yoga, all powers will be combined and included in the transmuting instrumentation. In page 613, our Lord Sri Aurobindo gives more explanation about integral yoga and says the principle in view is a self-surrender, a giving up of the human being into the being, consciousness, power, delight of the divine, union or communion at all the points of meeting in the soul of man, the mental being by which the divine himself, directly and without will, master and possessor of the instrument, shall by the light of his presence and guidance perfect the human being in all the forces of the nature for a divine living. Here we arrive at a further enlargement of the objects of the yoga. The common initial purpose of all yoga is the liberation of soul of the man from its present natural ignorance and its limitations, its release into spiritual being, its union with the higher self and divinity. But ordinarily, this is made not only the initial but the whole and final object. Enjoyment of spiritual being there is, but either in a dissolution of the human and individual into the silence of self-being, or on a higher plane in another existence. It is the wider view of our spiritual potentialities from which we begin, but we add another stress which brings in a completer significance. We regard the spirit in man not as solely an individual being traveling to a transcendent unity with the divine, but as a universal being capable of oneness with the divine in all souls and all nature, and we give this extended view its entire practical consequence. The human soul, individual liberation, and enjoyment of union with the divine in the spiritual being, consciousness, and delight must always be the first object of integral yoga. Its free enjoyment of the cosmic unity of the divine becomes a second object. But out of that, a third appears, the effectuation of the meaning of the divine unity with all beings by a sympathy and participation in the spiritual purpose of the divine in humanity. The individual yoga, integral yoga, then turns from its separateness and becomes a part of collective yoga of the divine nature in the human race. The liberated individual being, united with the divine in self and spirit, becomes in his natural being a self perfecting instrument for the perfect outflowering of the divine in humanity. This outflowering has its two terms. First comes the growth out of the separative human ego into the unity of the spirit, then the possession of the divine nature in its proper and its higher forms, and no longer in the inferior forms of the mental being, which are a mutilated translation and not the authentic text of the original script of divine nature in the cosmic individual. In other words, a perfection has to be aimed at which amounts to the elevation of the mental into the full spiritual and supramental nature. Therefore, this integral yoga of knowledge, love, and works has to be extended into a yoga of spiritual and Gnostic self perfection. As Gnostic knowledge, will, and Ananda are a direct instrumentation of the Spirit and can only be won by growing into the Spirit, into the Divine Being, this growth has to be the first aim of our yoga. The mental being has to enlarge itself into the oneness of the divine before the divine will perfect in the soul of the individual its Gnostic outflowering. That is the reason why the triple way of knowledge, works, and love becomes the keynote of the complete integral yoga, for that is the direct means for the soul in mind to rise to its highest intensities where it passes upward into divine oneness. That too is the reason why the yoga must be integral. For if emergence in the infinite or some close union with the divine where all our aim and integral yoga would be superfluous, except for such greater satisfaction of the being of man as we may get by a self lifting of the whole of it towards its source. But it would not be needed for the essential aim, since by any single power of the soul nature we can meet with the divine, each at its height rises up into the infinite and absolute. Each therefore offers a sufficient way of arrival, for all the hundred separate paths meet in the eternal. But the Gnostic being is a complete enjoyment and possession of the whole divine and spiritual nature, and it is a complete lifting of the whole nature of man into its power of a divine and spiritual existence. Integrality becomes then an essential condition of this yoga. At the same time, we have seen that each of the three ways, at its height, it is pursued with a certain largeness, can take into itself the powers of others and lead to their fulfillment. It is therefore sufficient to start by one of them and find the point at which it meets the other at first parallel lines of advance and melts them by its own widenings. At the same time, a more difficult, complex, whole, powerful process would be to start, as it were, on three lines together on a triple wheel of soul power. But the consideration of this possibility must be postponed till we have seen what are the conditions and meanings of integral yoga of self perfection. For we shall see that this also need not be postponed entirely, but a certain preparation of it is part of a certain initiation into it proceeds by the growth of the divine works, love, and knowledge. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says under the topic the integral perfection, a divine perfection of the human being is our aim. We must know, then, first, what are the essential elements that constitute man's total perfection. Secondly, what we mean by a divine as distinguished from a human perfection of our being. That man, as a being, is capable of self development and of some approach, at least to an ideal standard of perfection, which his mind is able to conceive, fix before it, and pursue, is common ground to all thinking humanity, though it may be only the minority who concern themselves with this possibility as providing the one most important aim of life. Next, chapter 15, topic Soul Force and Fourfold Personality, page 714. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says the perfecting of the normal mind, heart, prana, and body gives us only the perfection of the psychophysical machine we have to use and creates certain right instrumental conditions for a divine life and works lived and done with a greater, purer, clearer power and knowledge. The next question is that of the force which is poured into these instruments and the one who works it for his universal ends. The force at work in us must be the manifest divine Shakti, the supreme or the universal force unveiled in the liberated individual being, who will be the doer of all the action and the power of his divine life, Karta. The one behind this force must be the manifest divine Shakti, the supreme or the universal force unveiled in the liberated individual being, who will be the doer of all the action and the power of his divine life, Karta. The one behind this force will be the Ishvara, the master of all being, with whom all our existence will be in our perfection, a yoga at once of oneness in being and of union in various relations of the soul and its nature with the Godhead, who is seated within us and in whom too we live, move, and have our being. It is this Shakti with the Ishvara in her or behind her, whose divine presence and way we have to call into all our being and life. For without this divine presence and this greater working, there can be no siddhi of the power of nature. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, all action of man in life is a nexus of the presence of the soul and the working of nature, Purusha and Prakriti. The presence and influence of the Purusha represents itself in nature as a certain power of our being, which we may call for our immediate purpose soul force, and it is always this soul force which supports all the workings of the powers of the reason, the mind, life, and body, and determines the caste of our conscious being and the type of our nature. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, the normal, ordinarily developed man possesses it in a subdued, a modified, a mechanized, submerged form as temperament and character. But that is only its most outward mold, in which Purusha, the conscious soul or being, seems to be limited, conditioned, and given some shape by mechanical Prakriti. The soul flows into whatever mouths of intellectual, ethical, aesthetic, dynamic, vital, physical mind and type the developing nature takes, can act only in the way this formed Prakriti lays on it and move in its narrow groove or relatively wider circle. The man is then sattvic, rajasic, or tamasic, or a mixture of these qualities, and his temperament is only a sort of subtler soul color which has been given to the major prominent operation of these fixed moods of his nature. Men of a stronger force get more of the soul power to the surface and develop what we call a strong or great personality. They have in them something of the vibhuti as described by the Gita, a higher power of being, often touched with or sometimes full of some divine afflatus or more than ordinary manifestation of the Godhead, which is indeed present in all, even in the weakest or most clouded living being. But here some special force of it begins to come out from behind the wheel of average humanity, and there is something beautiful, attractive, splendid or powerful in these exceptional persons, which shines out in their personality, character, life, and work. These men too work in the type of their nature force according to its gunas, but there is something evident in them and yet not easily analyzable, which is in reality a direct power of the self and spirit using to strong purpose the mold and directions of the nature. The nature itself thereby rises to or towards a higher grade of its being. Much in the working of the force may seem egoistic or even perverse, but it is still the touch of the Godhead behind. Whatever Daivik, Asuric, or even Rakshasic form it may take, which drives the Prakriti and uses it for its own greater purpose. A still more developed power of the being will bring about the real character of this spiritual presence, and it will then be seen as something impersonal and self existence and self power, a sheer soul force which is other than the mind force, life force, force of intelligence, but drives them, and even while following to a certain extent the mold of working, guna, type of nature, yet puts a stamp of initial transcendence, impersonality, pure fire of spirit, or something behind the gunas of our normal nature. When the spirit in us is free, then what was behind this soul force comes out in all its light, beauty, and greatness. The Spirit, the Godhead, who makes the nature and soul of man his foundation and living representative in cosmic being, mind, action, and life.